Hey everybody, welcome back to my YouTube channel. For this weekend project, we'll be making these cornhole boards with custom vinyl decals. If you find this video helpful, please consider subscribing. To get started, the very first thing we need to do is cut our material to length. For the perimeter of the cornhole boards, I'm using these pine 1x4s. And the process here is pretty simple. What you see me doing is cutting them to rough length. So this is not going to be the final length of these boards because we will be cutting a 90-degree miter on them later. I'm cutting these down so that I can have more manageable pieces. Once I have those cut to rough length, I run them over my table saw, cutting about 3/8 of an inch through. Then I can turn it on its side and do the exact same thing on this side. This is going to leave a perfect 3/8 of an inch channel for the plywood to set in later. Now it's time to cut these to their final length. And to do this, I set my miter saw to 45 degrees, and then I measure out those cuts. A good way when you're batch cutting is to use referential measurement. So instead of measuring each board individually, you cut one and then use that one to mark the other boards. Measuring and cutting this way allows you to be a lot more uniform in lengths. So with everything cut out, I can move on to assembling the frames. To assemble them, I first dry fit everything together to make sure it all lines up, and then I grab 2 ratchet straps because one wasn't long enough to go all the way around, and lay them out very loosely around the boards. My goal is to add glue and tighten down this ratchet strap so that it applies even pressure on all 4 corners. Typically when you're woodworking, you want to avoid a lot of glue squeeze out because it doesn't take stain very well. However, in this instance, I'm going to be painting these, so if there's a lot of glue squeeze out, it really doesn't matter. I can sand it away and paint right over the top of it. So after soliciting some free labor from my wife, I could get it all clamped together. I started by tightening the ratchet strap just enough to add some friction, and then centered the ratchet strap on all 4 corners and tightened it down. Now that everything was securely held together, I could go around and measure for square. What you're looking for here is that both of these diagonals are the exact same length. Once I got them the exact same length, I set it there for about 30-45 minutes just to make sure it was tacky enough to stay in place. Then I clamped it to the edge of my workbench and drove in 2 1-inch finish nails on either side. This cornhole board is going to last for a lifetime, so I want to make sure it's as strong as I possibly can get it. Once I was done with that, I set them aside to dry and moved on to cutting the insert panels. Using a 4-foot level as a guide, I just ran my circular saw across and got a very nice even cut. Before I could set these panels in, I wanted to add a nice bead of glue all the way around the grooves. I will also be adding 1-inch finish nails on each of the 4 sides, but the glue is what's really going to hold it together. Now I can set those panels in and get this secured. It's really worth your time and energy to make sure these measurements are exact before you cut. As my father always said, measure twice, cut once. Now I got these 1x4s from my local big box store, Home Depot, so it's fairly impossible to get perfectly straight boards, so I'm using these clamps to pull all of the loose places very tight together, then I'm coming back with 1-inch finish nails and securing everything in place. I start with one side, flip it around, and do the other. Then I take off the clamps, flip it on its side, resecure it to the workbench, and do the exact same thing. Since I'm a hobbyist, I stick to my Ryobi tools and I find them to work very well. However, with this specific finish nailer, it doesn't always sink the nails completely in. So I have to use a nail set and inset some of those nails so that I can go ahead and wood fill behind them and make sure I have a perfectly flush surface for the paint. I also take some time to plane down the 1x4 sides to be perfectly flush with the plywood. Planing is potentially my favorite part of woodworking. It's relaxing and it really satisfies any OCD tendencies that I have. If you don't have a planer, I recommend going to Home Depot and picking up a block plane. They're only about $12 and you will use it for everything. To wood fill all of those holes, I mixed up some sawdust and wood glue and used a popsicle stick to push that into each of the individual nail holes. I laid it on very thick so that I would only have to do this once, and it turned out to work very well. The next day, I came back and used my random orbit sander to sand all of that wood filler flush. This is potentially the most satisfying part of the project so far. The next task is to cut out the 6-inch holes for the beanbags. I first use an aluminum square to mark out exactly where the center of the hole is. Then I use the 6-inch hole saw that I got on Amazon for about $20. This was potentially the hardest hole I have ever drilled. Dealing with that amount of friction, my drill just did not want to do it, so I went slow. The key that I found was really to not apply that much pressure. The next task was to give a slight round over to the top of the hole so that the beanbags wouldn't catch. A trim router would be perfect for this, but I only have a plunger router. It's a little bit beefy, but I made up this plexiglass jig that allows me to use it safely. Now that it's time to cut the legs, it's probably good that we talk about regulations. As per the American Cornhole Association, it requires that your cornhole board be 48 inches long by 24 inches wide and be 12 inches off the ground. It also requires the hole to be 6 inches in diameter and centered 9 inches from the top of the board. Even though the association is American, this is a standard that is used globally. So as you just saw me do, I cut 4 legs, all of which are oversized, and then rounded off the corners. I drilled a small hole in the end of one to accept a nail, and I used that nail to mark the cornhole boards where I needed to drill. Now that I have a reference point, I can transfer that hole to each of the 4 legs and to both sides of the cornhole boards. Now the bolts I'm using have what's called a square neck. I first use that bolt to mark exactly where it lands and then use a chisel and a mallet to hog away some of the material. This will allow that bolt to sit flush. Next, I use a paint can and a scrap of wood to set the board at the industry standard height. Then I use the top of my workbench to measure exactly where I want to cut. If you want to find the exact angle, you can do this on a miter saw, but I felt it was quicker to just use a handsaw and cut on that line. Now it's time to move on to paint. Since these cornhole boards are going to be dragged outside constantly, I wanted to make sure that they would stand up to the elements. So I started with 2 coats of primer and then added 2 coats of paint. Now, painting is definitely my least favorite part of making anything, but I can't argue with how transformational it is. Now it's time to add the decal. After getting it perfectly centered, I added 2 very large wrenches, which I found on Facebook Marketplace for $5 and just couldn't pass up. And I used those to hold down the decal while I adhered it. The method I used was to first adhere one side and then slowly work my way down to the other. By doing it this way, I had really good control over the amount of air I was introducing under the decal. This means less air bubbles and less work after the fact. Since I don't have a roller, I used a putty knife and a cloth to push down and ensure good adhesion across all surfaces, and to also make sure I get rid of any little air bubbles that I could find. Now that that is stuck down very nicely, I could go and cut out the 6-inch hole with a utility knife. Go slow, take your time, and use a brand new blade in your utility knife. The last thing we want to do is for it to get caught and bunch up. And the last thing to do for the decal is trim it on all 4 sides. Now that all of the finish work is done, we can move on to finally assembling these cornhole boards. I first added that square neck bolt, then a large washer, a lock washer, and then the nut at the end. Then I can use a wrench to tighten it down and do the exact same thing to the other side. Make sure you don't tighten it down too much though. I'm making this board for my friend, and they sent over this light that goes just underneath the hole. This is something that I didn't personally think of, but after she sent it over, I thought it was so cool. It is a must-have if you're going to make a cornhole board. The good news is that if you've already made them, it's something you can just attach onto the back. If you wanted, you could leave these cornhole boards as is. They'd be perfectly functional and just as pretty. But I wanted to add some more features to make it a little bit more user-friendly. I wanted these cornhole boards to be transported very easily, so I added 4 latches, 2 on each side, and this allows them to be latched securely to each other, and then you can move them around. Then I drilled out the holes and attached a handle to each of the boards. With these two features combined, you can move around these cornhole boards very easily, and I was very pleased with the result. Many of the cornhole boards you see others make on the internet are made from 2x4s and 1/2-inch thick plywood. It was very intentional that I used 1x4s even though they have additional bow because they are far lighter. And believe me when I say this, you are not sacrificing strength in any way by going with 1x4s. These boards are incredibly sturdy and will last a lifetime. And here's a quick example of just how easy it is to carry these out, set them up, and get playing. So that's a wrap on this one. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button. It shows YouTube that it's a worthwhile watch and will recommend it to other people. Also, if you're not subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It'll allow you to see all of my future content.